We embark today on a journey into the profound realms of philosophical thought, exploring the intricate relationship between two monumental figures, Aristotle and Hegel. This is not a simple comparison, but an excavation of shared foundations, divergent paths, and a convergence of ideas that spans centuries. Welcome to Philosophy, Science, and Beyond, a place where curiosity meets knowledge. Our journey begins by examining Hegel's own acknowledgement of a critical point in his work. In Hegel's grand system, there are places where the architectural structure of his thought reaches its peak. These are the passages, particularly within the phenomenology of spirit, the science of logic, and his later lectures, where one would expect to find the ultimate crowning idea. Yet, paradoxically, Hegel encounters a profound challenge: the inability to articulate this ultimate point in a way that is conceptually and terminologically satisfactory. This peak, this pinnacle of his system, eludes precise linguistic capture, leaving a sense of disappointment in the face of such ambitious thought. However, there is one striking exception. In the final pages of his Encyclopedia, the German text abruptly halts, yielding to a few lines in Greek. These untranslated lines, as if stepping into an inner sanctum, speak of the spirit's existence as the self-knowing of reason and of God, eternity, and blessedness. These are direct quotations from Aristotle's Metaphysics, specifically Book Lambda. Hegel concludes his Encyclopedia with this quote, without any further commentary, letting Aristotle's words stand alone. This act is deeply significant. Hegel perceives Aristotle's words as so definitive, so conclusive, that they speak for themselves, requiring no further elaboration. It is as if Hegel acknowledges that human thought, in its conceptual representations, has never reached such heights before, nor should it hope to surpass it in the future. These are the words of a philosophical predecessor, which stand alone, influencing the core of his thought. This placement by Hegel reveals a key insight. Hegel sees himself in fundamental agreement with Aristotle. He understands himself as an Aristotelian, and in this way, he reinterprets the old master beyond centuries of misunderstanding. Hegel places Aristotle's words where the eternal truth is realized and completed. Herein lies a key to understanding Hegel's place in history. It is a mistake to view him solely through the lens of Kant and Fichte. Such a limited view is born from the fact that Kant represents a closing of accounts with old metaphysics for us. But while Kant himself has been misunderstood, Hegel is even less understood from this perspective. His thought surpasses the boundaries of that perspective and represents a unique synthesis of historical accumulation, extending all the way back to classical philosophers of antiquity. This is a historical understanding of Hegel that has not yet been fully developed. We are still too close to him to have a fully objective view. The recent return to Hegel in some circles does not reach the essence of the matter. There are many brilliant ideas about Hegel, but not much work that has deeply assimilated his actual philosophy. The problem lies in the philosophical lack of understanding of the positivist era, and also in the intellectual deficiencies of the old Hegelians, who made philosophy from the final links of the system while barely reading the science of logic, the main work. The science of logic remains largely unread even today, lacking the necessary key to unlock its meaning. A study of Hegel is useless without interpreting the logic, as if the philosophy of spirit did not have its roots in it. Hegel's interest in the latter does not change anything. The foundations are only in the logic. But how do we approach the logic? The proximity between Hegel and Aristotle illuminates it, especially the metaphysical depths it holds, and not in areas such as history or law. And here, traditional Aristotelianism itself acts as an obstacle. All living problems here have turned into stagnant and rigid concepts. Since the end of the Middle Ages, there have only been two great Aristotelians, Leibniz and Hegel. Both were original thinkers, not just interpreters. If there is to be any illumination of Aristotle, it will come from this direction. Leaving Leibniz aside, it can be said that Aristotle must be re-examined, and we cannot begin from someone we think we already fully understand to try to understand the other. On both sides, there is a need for similar new insights. This is the place where a comparison over centuries can be instructive. Each complements the other, with the other helping us understand things that we do not directly understand in the one. From the unsolved problems of Hegel's logic, we can learn to see the great dilemmas of Aristotle's Metaphysics, and vice versa. Two paths leading to a common goal create the possibility for a philosophical understanding that includes a sense for their parallel points. There are two historical tasks to unify into a single research direction. Furthermore, considering how both thinkers were the philosophical culmination of their times, Aristotle of the classical antiquity, Hegel of German idealism, the task that emerges is not to be underestimated. Hegel himself made an effort for this path to be followed. One of his main claims is that the history of philosophy and the developmental structures in his system are identical. Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy are the best introduction to his own system. But it is up to Aristotle to take the decisive step, the transition from essence to concept. Plato's theory of ideas teaches that the foundation of all objects is their essence, which is revealed in them in a universal and timeless way. However, Aristotle's argument is that the truth of this essence is another thing. It is the concept, which is truly logical, universal, but also hyper-universal. It is on this third level, the level of the concept, that Hegel's dialectic moves. Here lies the basis of both panlogicism and the teleological progress of history. Because, according to this understanding, it is not being, but concept that is actual. In this context, Hegel must be seen as an Aristotelian. The connection between the two thinkers can be seen in three areas: certain basic elements of the method, the relationship between logic and ontology, and teleological metaphysics. The main arguments are found in the second point, the most obvious ones in the third, and the most inconspicuous ones in their parallelisms in the first. However, it is precisely these that are most important for historical understanding. In an ordinary examination of Aristotle, it seems as if there is a vast separation between him and Hegel. Hegel values the a priori absolutely. If the phenomena do not match what is a priori, then so much the worse for the phenomena. Aristotle is, in contrast, somewhat of an empiricist. Saving the phenomena is his constantly reiterated fundamental demand. His entire process of knowing ascends in four stages: aesthesis, sensory perception; mneme, memory; empiric experience; and episteme, knowledge. In this ascension, pure thought is secondary, yet this separation is superficial. For Aristotle, all induction is just preparation. It is indispensable, but it does not lead to the goal alone. Induction is, in the full sense of the word, a direction that leads to a place. It starts from what is first for us, proteron pros haemus, and leads to what is first in itself, or according to the object, proteron haplos. True knowledge begins from what is first in itself. The assumption here is that the universals that form the sought prius are already present in what is given, but they are not known yet, inusai lelethasin. Therefore, it is necessary to reveal them first. The starting point is always what is closer to perception, but it is further away in itself. This must be taken more literally than it may seem at first. The starting point itself is epistemologically already a universal. Although the sensation is valid for the individual object, and every sensed quality is necessarily a quality of the individual object, this quality in the sensation is related to it. But in reality, only the universal is sensed in the individual object. Qualities such as red, green, bitter, and sweet are common to countless objects, but these are what are perceived. Sensation, therefore, does not give the individual object as an individual object, but only its universal. Of course, these universals are not given anywhere in a pure form, but rather mixed and confused, synchekemina. If what is given only replaces the individual object, this, in reality, only replaces the universal. This, in turn, requires a completely different kind of research. On the other hand, the final point of the ascension is not the universal, the eidos, form, species in the real sense. It cannot be reached by epagoge, induction. Aristotle knows that induction does not reach a true universal. It needs to be known in advance. He does not fall into the error of attributing to Bacon's enumeratio simplex something that is not inherently part of it. How could Aristotle believe that he could reach in this way the universal which, for him, is characterized by being valid in every singular case? Because the universal is in the essence of the phenomenon and is related to it. Only in the essence itself can the universal be examined. Therefore, it must be observed indirectly in a way other than induction. Yet how could Aristotle see induction as a guide toward the universal? There is a jump between it and the goal, regardless of what it is. The Platonic method of hypothesis, which could act as an intermediary, is missing in Aristotle. The theory seems to present a gap in the most important place. However, there is no jump here, and the theory is completely sound. Aristotle assumes that the universal kathalo is inherent in the singular entity, hekaston. There is no universal separated from things. This is a vain abstraction. There is no way out other than being inside them, in them. In Aristotle, ide forms species are not Plato's ideas. They do not exist as separate chorisτα. Of course, like the ideas, they also give expression to a being in itself. But this is the being in itself of things, kath auto on, so the universal can only be found in the individual object itself. This is a truly Hegelian claim. The abstract universal is not the real universal. It is always the concrete one. But we are just at the beginning. More in-depth research is needed. The method that Aristotle developed in the Analytics is ultimately only for the sciences. It is not the method of philosophy, or a method of its own. He never developed this, and he would not have found it even if he had consciously sought it. No one can penetrate the foundations of the method with which they work. The method consciousness is always secondary when compared with the working method. There is no pure method thought before the working method. In this sense, there is no a priori method consciousness. All knowledge about method emerges through reflection upon the working method. Reflection necessarily comes later. Therefore, what a philosopher who intuitively finds new paths cannot do, his successors can do easily, to reveal the kind of method later on. So what does Aristotle's philosophical method look like? The first thing that draws attention is his effort to resolve the meanings of philosophical terms, the clarification of polysemous words. It always starts from the question, in how many different senses is a word used? How many different senses there are, to Pusakos, is the object of the entire book Della of the Metaphysics. It also precedes other researches as a preliminary question. Perhaps the most familiar of these are the meanings of substance in the Metaphysics. The meanings of motion, unity, and infinity are no less common. The method that appears everywhere, regardless of the object's distinction, is a pure a priori self-analysis method. This is close to the clarification of the meaning of concepts, starting with polysemous words, which today's phenomenology has made a habit of putting at the beginning of all researches. However, this is just preparation. The true aporetic investigation goes deeper. Plato also had already placed the concept of aporia, verbal helplessness, at the center, describing it as knowing that one does not know. Aporia is the ancient concept of a problem. The awareness of the difficulty in progressing further is the decisive step in passing from not knowing to knowing. Understanding facts arises from a clear understanding of the whole set of problems. In Aristotle, the investigation and clarification of dilemmas becomes the main method. This is the main part of his truly philosophical works. What is characteristic of this work is that what is not understood in problems is investigated solely for its own sake, regardless of what might emerge later, of course, independent of the doctrines that must be defended. The value of these researches cannot be exhausted in the constructive parts that are connected to this work. The researches are as illuminating for today's readers as they were for the readers of antiquity. Moreover, this is true even in those places where we have long since and forever separated from Aristotle from a systematic point of view. The famous dilemmas of matter and eidos, dynamis and energeia exidentia, as well as the dilemmas of symbibekos, accident, contingency, to hypoteiches and infinity, aperon, are of this kind. This method spreads throughout all branches of research. Physics, psychology, ethics, poetics are all built upon it in the same way. In these works, almost everything that is the subject of pure aporetic investigations proves itself as a permanent supra-historical gain. This is not surprising. The method carries extraordinary potential within its humility. When considered solely in itself, it is entirely indifferent to metaphysical views. That is, it is independent from the transience of personal opinions. Indeed, it can be said that the method in Aristotle's thought stands beside all theories, claims, and philosophical doctrines, at an equal distance from them. In short, it does not coincide with them. The real content of the investigations in Aristotle's intellectual work is hidden in the method. The method constantly directs itself toward contradictions, in opposition to dogmas. It forces constant deepening in the problems themselves. It expresses a deep respect for the eternal content of the problems. It is supported by the basic belief that we humans do not derive problems through our views and opinions. Rather, we find them as problems that are undeniably also placed before us by a single and existing world. They are not necessarily solvable problems that we can grasp or distort, but cannot derive or change. This is why the remarkable purity in the progress of all aporetic investigations, the denial of speculative expectations that look for results, the acceptance of all results, even the most unusual ones, as they are, and the similar detachment from any interest in proof, in short, its methodological purposelessness, all arise from this. Aristotle is the master of this method. He has remained a classic in this regard for all ages. The aporetic art has almost been lost for those who live today. It is lacking in our thinking, so it is not easy to relearn it. We cannot learn it anywhere else but from Aristotle, from its source. But precisely this connection is what we lack. Up to this point, Aristotle's aporetic is as opposed to Hegel as possible. Hegelian dialectics does not recognize a disinterested, non-speculative problem-solving. The situation changes when we look at the original philosophical ideas toward which aporetic directs one. In other words, it perhaps always leads to the discovery of internal contradictions. In contemporary terms, it can also be said, this science directs one to antinomies. After a while, basic philosophical problems reveal their content in the form of antitheses. The real dilemma reaches its highest level precisely at this point. It is self-evident that this hidden fact does not manifest itself in the same way in all problems. However, wherever the aporetic directs one to one of the final metaphysical foundations, it manifests itself with a certain regularity. The conflict becomes clear, for example, in the concept of matter. Matter is something that does not really exist, but which is also real. Something comprehensible, but also absolutely incomprehensible. A principle that is indifferent and undetermined, but also differentiating and determining all individuality. Similarly, eidos is the first, the principle, but it also contains a series of differentiations in its composition. The TNAI essence presupposes this. This conflict is thoroughly prepared in the resolutions and covers the entire metaphysics from Book Z onward, without reaching a solution anywhere. The situation becomes clearer in the analysis of motion in Book 3 of Physics. According to Aristotle, there are two modes of being, dynamis and energia. Motion is clearly neither one nor the other. It is not a potentiality because, on the contrary, it is actual. But it is not complete or fulfilled because it is an unfulfilled, progressing, and continuous process. Aristotle does not hesitate to include this contradiction in the factual definition of motion. He defines it as the actuality of what exists potentially insofar as it is such is motion. The emphasis lies on insofar as it is such. The potentially existent has a kind of completeness because it is such, even if it does not have completeness, actuality at all. Motion arises from this. This is the only complete concept of motion possible, which can arise from Aristotelian principles. That which has developed into entelecheia, complete actuality, no longer moves, while that which is merely potential does not move yet. Motion is a form of being in between, a process of realization, an incomplete completeness. It could also be said that it is non-actual actuality. The reason for incompleteness is the potentiality that is activity itself. Here, the dialectic of motion clearly goes beyond the dynamis-energeia relation, which was developed in the Metaphysics. It is the greatness of Aristotle's unconditional aporetic consistency that he recognizes the conflict with all its weight that he includes it in the definition of motion without eliminating it. What seems impossible is shown to be exactly what is actual. The positive element in the dialectic of a fundamental metaphysical essence could not be more clearly recognized and revealed. Perhaps an example that goes even deeper is the concept of first entelecheia. Its most familiar place is the definition of the soul in the second book of De Anima. The soul is the first entelecheia of a natural body that has life potentially. A naturally structured body has life potentially, as is seen in the dead organism, which does not actually have it. What it lacks is the principle of life, the eidos of vitality. This is what is meant by the expression first entelecheia. So far, everything is understandable. But what does first entelecheia mean? Entelecheia means complete and perfect actualization. On the other hand, it is not the complete and perfect actualization of the body to which it is the principle. Rather, it is in it from the beginning, guiding its growth and development from the embryo onward. In short, it is hidden in it long before it is realized and reaches its most perfect form. It is the actuality before actuality. It is the determined final purpose of the living thing that is in it before it is actually achieved. Nothing else is possible in a natural teleological universe. Such a first entelecheia must exist, separate from the later factual realization, which is, so to speak, a second entelecheia, and may not exist if the realization process is prevented. But can such a first actuality exist before actual realization? Isn't this a contradiction in itself? Here there is a self-contradictory state of affairs that overlaps with the entire teleological metaphysics. Aristotle reaches the conclusion without hesitation, and moreover in a positive sense. He recognizes the conflict. He includes it in the definition of the soul, and even in the foundations of metaphysics, because every eidos, when considered solely in itself, is first entelecheia. It is pure energia that directs all factual processes toward the realization of a pre-existing form in a specific matter. The contradictory nature of the first entelecheia is where everything comes to rest. The same situation can be shown in the energeia aporetic in Book of the Metaphysics. Energeia presupposes dynamis, so it must rightly come after it. However, it is proven in detail that it rightly precedes dynamis, not only for us, premise, but also in itself. Energeia is both prius and posterius for the being itself. This splits its concept in two, just as it does in the case of entelecheia. Yet Aristotle accepts it as a foundation that has unity, because the problem itself requires this unity. The situation is no different when it comes to the primus motor, first mover, in Book L. It has to be a motionless mover. Otherwise, it would not be the first mover. Even if it were the first mover, its movement would not be continuous. However, motion begins from it. Moreover, continuously and eternally. Because such a movement is the movement of the heavens and ultimately the movement of all beings in the universe, it is an eternal movement. Therefore, movement and immobility must exist simultaneously in its essence. The same situation returns more clearly in the other side of the principle, which is conceived as pure mind, nous, the thinking that thinks itself. Here, the thinker and the thought are put as identical, but not as indistinguishable in their identity. Because the thought, the object of thought, is what is moving and will always remain so in the liveliness of the mind. On the other hand, since the only perfect thinking is thinking the most perfect object, this object can only be thinking itself. In its essence that encompasses everything, the mind divides itself in two and remains so. Yet, this very being is not only one, it is at the same time the principal unity in the various divisions of the universe and everything. Here, Aristotle recognizes the antinomy without eliminating it in the essence of the object. It is not difficult to recognize a very specific type of method in these examples. It can hardly be called anything other than dialectic. Furthermore, if it is considered that what is being talked about are the most fundamental concepts of Aristotle's metaphysics, it will be necessary to give this dialectical element in his thinking a central place for better or for worse. There is no difference between saying that the antinomies that are developed by the aporetic are unsolvable and saying that they can only be solved dialectically. Dialectical solutions are nothing more than the recognition of the contradiction in the real state of affairs. In this sense, it can be said that Aristotle is fundamentally a dialectician. He is a dialectician in a different sense than Plato, who follows the dialectical data as they are, directly using them to test conclusions. Aristotle's methodical progress remains aporetic until the end as an investigation of problems. On the other hand, it exhibits the highest principles to which the investigation of the dialectical nature of the object is directed. In this way, he becomes a dialectician, even against his own will, because here, the essentialities are examined, from which nothing can be given up. Therefore, the same situation repeats itself everywhere without stopping. Aristotle sees that the higher synthesis requires the conflict between the thesis and the antithesis. Thus, he posits what is contradictory in itself as factual. Because of this necessity, what cannot be thought in unity in itself is conceived as unified in the object. Yet this is none other than Hegel's method. This is dialectical, and in a much deeper, more timeless sense than Hegel's dialectic, which often makes up false solutions where there are no solutions. At first glance, the logics of Aristotle and Hegel seem completely separate. Aristotle's organon is a static logic. It gets lost in rigid connections and dependencies. All concepts here have a somewhat limited, motionless state. This is why deduction, syllogism, and the obvious necessity of proof have a superior position. However, there is also a side to this logic that exceeds the limits of immobility. Moreover, this is in the place that one would expect the least, in the syllogism. For Aristotle, the emphasis in the syllogism is not in the premises or in the conclusion, but rather in the middle term, terminus medius. The essence of the syllogism is that the conclusion does not lie in either the major premise or the minor premise, but that it nevertheless comes from them. The conclusion is nothing more than the expression of their synthesis. However, the synthesis itself is a function of mediation, and the foundation of mediation is the middle term. The proposition aiton de to meson, the middle term is the reason, the foundation, can be described as the highest principle of Aristotle's syllogism theory. In science, the point to which the main subject matter is attached is not so much the major terms as it is the middle terms. The eidos, species, not genos, genus, is the carrier of the extraordinary nature of the logical function in which new content is formed, that is, of the mediation. In the analytics, as in the metaphysics, this functional element, which constitutes the true meaning of what is logical, not only in the syllogism, but also in judgment and concept by indirect means, raises logic above the external formal character, which was unjustly attributed to it by those who came later. In this way, logic has actually progressed to the very border of dialectics, to its closest point. The middle term is the dialectical stop in the syllogism. Hegel's dialectic stems from the task of creating a higher organon that would shed light on the functions of the lower-level organon, drawing these functions into the logical theory itself. This is a dynamic logic with its moving and resolving concepts. Every definition here is the definition of a moment in the flow that is moving unitarily and limitlessly, the definition of a universe. Everywhere there are mediations where the emphasis lies. All concepts are at the same time acra and mesa, extremes and middle terms. This is where their polysemy is hidden. The syllogism flows in them continuously and without stopping. This is not the place to investigate whether this method is based in the object itself, or whether it is another one-sided logic like static logic, which is the opposite end. With the abolition of the principle of non-contradiction, the transformation takes place at once. This principle, which constitutes the basis of the old logic, meant that all contradiction was excluded from the field of logic. Therefore, the abolition of the principle means the abolition of this exclusion. In other words, it means including what is contradictory in the field of the logical. The immobility of concepts depends on the principle of non-contradiction. When this is eliminated, the rigidities dissolve, and concepts cover and interpenetrate one another. The power of the negative, as it is said in the preface to the Phenomenology, presents itself as a power that does not allow concepts to settle down, it drags them along, because everything already contains its opposite in itself. This is true primarily for the simple categorical judgment. It is both true and not true. In essence, it is only a part of truth. The judgment, A is B absolutely requires the judgment that is in contradiction with it. A is not B, because if this does not apply, then the other remains a mere tautology. In short, not even a judgment. Does this eliminate the meaning of the judgment A is B? Both yes and no. Rather, it is eliminated in three senses. First, it is negated, then it is preserved in its opposite, and finally, it is raised to a new higher meaning. This triple meaning of elimination mediates the flow of the dialectic, which connects everything. That which is eliminated has not been destroyed. It continues to live as itself, but also as something else. The continuity of the dialectical flow does not prevent the emergence of visible ruptures or turning points. These are the places where the fluidity of certainties once again becomes tangible, up to a certain level. Otherwise, the dialectical progression cannot be grasped even approximately in concepts because these perceptions continue to remain in a static nature. When the conclusions that lie in this thought are reached, a collective perspective emerges, according to which, in general, motionless concepts, static essences that can be grasped in them, constitute the human rational in logic. The pure unity of truth is not mixed in with this rational, but through it, this unity can be approximately followed in its fluidity. In this way, all rigid concept formation is a quality of the finite understanding, not to say its inability. In contrast, the true essences will have a fluid nature. Of course, in itself, the situation may be the reverse. The dialectic, which recognizes no obstacles in its flow, may be a human-specific appearance on its own, as a rationally reduced, distorted picture of the logical main structure. The main structure may well be a substantiality that does not get mixed up and lost in any intellectual flow. In this case, flow would be a formal characteristic in the higher stages of development of reason. However, none of this is necessarily sufficient to grasp the logical substantial structure. The fact that the dialectic is more successful than the logic of this static understanding does not contradict this situation. Which of the two views is correct is necessarily left open. For Hegel, of course, this question is out of the question. For panlogicians, there is no irrationality behind reason. For idealists, there is no being behind thinking. Yet if the dialectic of thinking conceals a dialectic of being behind it, which in itself may well be the case, then the question becomes quite important. But even so, the question does not necessarily have to be solvable. It may also be a metaphysical question that arises again and again as a residual problem that cannot be solved in the entire progress of understanding. The understanding that sees the essence of the dialectic as a thesis, antithesis, synthesis in three steps is fundamentally filled with errors. With such schemas, no matter how true they are externally, the perspective that will grasp the subject in depth is completely blinded. The method is in fact much more complex. It changes according to content, and the moments of the triplets intersect with different rhythms. In this way, they gain relativity. What is an antithesis in one sense can become a thesis again in another sense. But the more important thing is the problem of synthesis. Is it really true that all antinomies can be resolved, that a synthesis can be found for every antithetical structure, as Hegel insisted on as a dogma? The rationalist will, of course, always affirm this, but the situation itself may be otherwise. There are also unsolvable antinomies. Indeed, when viewed correctly, solvable antinomies are no longer real antinomies. In them, conflict is really only a result of ignorance about facts that are united or harmonious. So the situation is more like this. The synthesis corresponding to a given thesis and antithesis is by no means predetermined. The meaning of dialectics does not lie in directing the entire antinomic structure to syntheses. Hegel's syntheses are generally not on par with the antithetical opening of the problem. The greatness of Hegel's dialectic does not lie in the solutions he provides, but rather more in the discovery of antinomies itself. These antinomies exist everywhere, but are hidden under the immobility of concepts. By eliminating immobility, dialectics reveals them and makes them visible. In this way, it brings countless problems to light for the first time and gives them conceptual clarity. In the end, this is none other than Aristotle's method. No matter how separate aporetic and dialectic may be in themselves, what they exhibit in principle is the same: the discovery of antinomies and their positive evaluation. The specific meaning of dialectics cannot be revealed as long as a specific schema of motion is assumed. This meaning lies in the holistic interconnectedness of essences, in the form discovered by Plato and further developed by Neoplatonism. The simploke of the ideas, the fact that individual elements stand in mutual conditionality, show constant and continuous dependencies, can only be defined through one another, and gain their existence only together, is inexhaustible. On the contrary, there is something more fundamental hidden behind all of this. A primary, original relatedness, in which even that which stands in relation first comes into being. Relatedness is no longer a sufficient word to describe this. The ones standing in relation are presupposed in the entire relation. Here they are not presupposed. Rather, they have been included in the relation itself. Of course, this is not a relatedness that is endless, and that ends up in complete relativism with no solid relation element. Rather, here, the categorical moments of the carrying subject and relation, which stand in opposition otherwise, have merged into one another. That is, they stand in a kind of synthetic identity, where what is posited as identical remains distinct. This is exactly what the inner necessity of the dialectical flow. We truly appreciate you taking the time to join us on this exploration of philosophy, science, and beyond. We hope this video has been both informative and inspiring. Please subscribe for more content like this, and feel free to share your thoughts and questions in the comments below. All the best.